Missile launch. Missile launch. The scream tore through the command center as 3 surface-to-air missiles ripped out of a canyon that intelligence swore was empty. 4 American fighter jets, trapped between granite walls, seconds from death. The base commander froze. The radar officer froze. Everyone froze. Except the quiet coffee girl in the back corner. The one nobody ever looked at twice. The one who poured coffee, calibrated radios, and disappeared into the walls of a base that never once wondered who she really was. She lunged for the microphone, bypassed every protocol, and spoke a call sign that made a decorated fighter pilot's blood run cold. Valkyrie. A legend the entire Air Force believed was grounded forever. A woman hiding burn scars, a father's dog tags, and a truth about to blow an entire chain of command wide open. She wasn't just going to save 4 pilots today. She was about to expose the man who murdered her father 5 years ago and nearly got away with it twice. The alarm hit before anyone understood what it meant. Not the siren, not yet. Just a single red light blinking on a console nobody was watching. Small, quiet, easy to miss, which was exactly the problem. Because 30 seconds later, 4 F-16s would be diving into a canyon that intelligence swore was empty. And in less than a minute, 3 surface-to-air missiles would be screaming off the canyon floor at Mach 3, hunting warm metal, hunting men who thought they were flying a milk run. The base called it Operation Anvil. Simple, clean, in and out before lunch. Nobody in that command center had any idea they were about to die in front of a woman who poured their coffee. Nobody knew her name was Valkyrie. Not yet. Forward Operating Base Ironhold sat carved into a slab of nothing. Scorched concrete, blast walls the color of old bone. A runway that shimmered like a mirage even at 7 in the morning. Heat already crawling up off the tarmac in visible waves. The air tasted like diesel, like pulverized sand and jet fuel, that sharp metallic bite that got into your throat and stayed there. To the pilots of the 104th Fighter Squadron, call sign Ghost Ironhold was a purgatory. A place you survived. A place you counted days in. But to Airman First Class Claire Ashford, it was something else entirely. It was the perfect place to disappear. She was 27, small-framed, dirt-smudged cheeks that never quite came clean, no matter how many times she scrubbed them in the communal showers. Dull blonde hair, always yanked back into a frayed scrunchie that had seen better decades. On paper, she was a junior communications technician. Nothing more, nothing less. Her days went like this. Untangle headset cords in the Tactical Operations Center. Calibrate the encrypted UHF radios until her fingers ached. Make sure the coffee pot in the briefing room never ran dry because God forbid Captain Derek Holt had to pour his own. The pilots looked through her. Not at her. Through her. Which suited Claire just fine. Because being invisible meant being safe. And being safe meant nobody asked questions. Nobody looked too closely at the scar tissue, tracing up her right forearm, thick and white and unmistakable, the kind of burn you only got from a cockpit fire. Nobody noticed the way her eyes tracked radar data like she'd been born reading it. Nobody wondered why a comms tech flinched every time an F-16 screamed off the runway. Under her tan t-shirt, tucked flat against her chest where no one would ever think to look, hung a pair of silver dog tags, wrapped tight in black electrical tape, silenced, so they wouldn't jingle, so they wouldn't catch light, so nobody would ask whose name was stamped into that metal. She hadn't taken them off in 3 years. 3 years since the fire, 3 years since the sky had opened up, and taken the only person on this earth who understood her completely. 3 years since a review board had stamped her file with 2 words that ended a career built on blood and sacrifice. Medically unfit. A lie. A convenient, tidy paperwork lie. But lies had a way of hardening into truth if enough people signed off on them. And enough people had. So Claire Ashford poured coffee and untangled cords and kept her head down until the day the sky decided otherwise. "Hey, radio girl." Captain Derek Holt's voice cracked across the briefing room like a whip, and Claire didn't even look up. She knew that tone. Knew it the way you know weather you didn't have to see the clouds to feel the pressure drop. Holt was barrel-chested, jaw carved from granite, or so he liked to think. ego size to match a runway. He tossed his helmet bag onto a folding chair like it owed him money, then dropped himself into the seat beside it, boots up on the table. Comms were static heavy on my Viper last sortie, he said. Tell the grease monkeys on the flight line to swap the antenna. Claire kept her eyes on the carafe in her hands. Yes, sir. And get me a black coffee. This sand's making my throat bleed. Yes, sir. Because that's what you said. Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. 3 words that cost nothing and revealed nothing. Behind Holt, Lieutenant Tyler Briggs leaned against the doorframe, laughing before the joke even landed. 23 years old. Still believed war was something you won, not something that took pieces of you and never gave them back. She looks like she'd blow away in a stiff breeze, Briggs said. Bet she doesn't even know what an F-16 is, Brick. Probably thinks it's a sports car, Holt said. Claire didn't answer, didn't flinch. Walked to the break room with the empty carafe cradled against her hip, her face arranged into something unreadable. Blank. Practiced. A mask she'd built one humiliation at a time until it fit like skin. But her hands. If anyone had bothered to actually really look, they would have seen the way her trembled just slightly as she filled the pot. Not from fear, from memory. Because pouring hot liquid always did it. Always dragged her back to a cockpit filling with smoke. Canopy jammed, heat licking up her arm before she even understood what was happening. The body remembered things the mind tried to bury. And Claire's body remembered everything. She set the carafe under the machine, pressed brew, and somewhere behind her ribs, in a place she never let anyone see, a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years whispered the same thing it always whispered. You're still in there, Valkyrie. Someday they're going to need you again. She told that voice to shut up. Most days it listened. Major Nathan Cole was different from the other two. Older, quieter, a face like a closed door, and about as much interest in conversation. His call sign was Grizzly, and he'd earned it the hard way 3 tours, 2 ejections, 1 divorce he never talked about. He didn't mock Claire, didn't really acknowledge her at all, which in its own strange way was almost a kindness. He sat now at the far end of the briefing table, chewing gum like it had personally wronged him, watching the wall clock tick toward 0800 with the flat patience of a man who'd stopped with being surprised by anything the desert threw at him. Anvil's a milk run, Holt was saying, mostly to himself, mostly because he liked the sound of his own confidence. In, drop out, home, by dinner. Famous last words, Cole muttered. You always say that, because it's always true until it isn't. Holt rolled his eyes. Claire, refilling sugar packets 3 feet away, felt something cold slide down the back of her neck. She didn't know why. Couldn't have explained it if someone had asked. Just a feeling. The kind of feeling she used to get in a cockpit half a second before instruments confirmed what her gut already knew. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong. Colonel Walter Grant walked into the Tactical Operations Center at 0750 with a mug of coffee in one hand and the particular relaxed posture of a man who had run 1,000 missions exactly like this one and expected the 1,001st to be no different. The talk hummed around him. Fluorescent lights, the low electronic murmur of radar scopes, screens glowing green against the dim interior, casting everyone's face in the same sickly, clinical light. Grant had run Ironhold for 2 years. Steady hands, predictable temper. The kind of commander who trusted intelligence. Reports the way other men trusted gravity without question, without hesitation, without citation. Because questioning them meant questioning the entire machine that kept this base breathing. Which was, in its own way, going to almost get 4 pilots killed today. He stood over the radar scopes watching 4 green blips align themselves at the edge of the display. Ghost flight. 4 F-16C Vipers, fully fueled, weapons hot, call signs cycling over the radio in clipped, professional tones. Ghost lead, this is Vanguard control. That was Lieutenant Eric Sanders at the JTAC station, young, eager, the kind of officer who still ironed his uniform even out here. You are approaching the ingress point. Weather is clear. You have green light for weapons hot. Copy that, Vanguard. Holt's voice, crackling through the speakers, dripping with the same confidence he wore in the briefing room. Ghost flight is dropping into the canyon. Pushing it up. Let's go melt some metal, boys. Grant allowed himself a small smile, sipped his coffee. And in the back corner of the room, in the shadowed console nobody paid attention to, Claire Ashford sat with a headset clamped over one ear, monitoring the data feed like she did every single day. Except today, something on her secondary monitor made her spine go rigid. A pulse. Faint, rhythmic, bleeding in from the canyon floor where nothing was to be transmitting at all. Her stomach dropped, because that valley was supposed to be dead space. Empty. No electronic signatures, no radar returns, nothing but rock and sand and silence. That's what the intel brief said. That's what everyone in this room believed with the easy confidence of people who had never once been wrong about it before. But the spectrum analyzer didn't lie, and it was showing her something that made her mouth go dry. X-band emission. Faint, growing. Not a walkie-talkie. Not insurgent chatter. X-band in a canyon like that, at that frequency, meant exactly one terrible thing. Tracking radar. Claire's heart began a slow, sickening roll in her chest. Because she knew this signature. Knew it the way you know a scar on your own skin. She'd seen it before. Felt it before. It had cost her everything the last time. She was on her feet before she'd finished the thought. Lieutenant Davis. No wrong name. She caught herself, throat tight. Sanders, sir. Tell them to abort. Sanders didn't even turn his head. Not now, Jenkins. Wrong name too. In his mouth, careless. The way people mispronounced things that didn't matter to them. They're entering the target area. I'm busy. Sir. Claire's voice dropped. Something in it shifted a register nobody in this room had ever heard from her before, low and taut, and impossible to ignore even as everyone somehow managed to ignore it. That's not a convoy down there. It's bait. I'm reading passive tracking on C-band, shifting to X-band right now. That's an SA-15 system, and it's painting them. Grant turned. Annoyance flickered across his face like static. Airman, what are you babbling about? There's a mobile SAM system in that canyon, Colonel. Intel says small arms. Maybe some unguided RPGs. He said it slow, like she needed the words simplified. There are no mobile SAM systems in this sector. They smuggled it in. Claire stepped forward. Couldn't stop herself, every muscle in her body screaming at her to sit back down, shut up, disappear the way she always did, and every muscle losing that argument. Colonel, if they drop below 10,000 feet in that gorge, they lose the turn radius to defeat a missile off the rail. You have to call them off now. Stand down, Airman. Grant's face flushed, color rising fast. Return to your station, that's an order. Claire froze. Every year of training screamed at her to obey. Discipline was a language she'd spoken since she was 18 years old. A language burned into her bones alongside everything else. But underneath that discipline, something older was howling. Something that had once flown into 6 SAM batteries in the dark to save 30 men, and hadn't once, not for a single second, considered turning back. She took a step backward, hands trembling, eyes locked on the screen, because she could see it now. Could see the shape of the trap the way a chess player sees checkmate. 3 moves early, the 4 green blips, sinking deeper into the narrowest part of the canyon. Granite walls rising on either side like the jaws of something patient and very old. 10 seconds, she counted them in her head. 1, 2, 3. She prayed she was wrong, she was not wrong. The toke erupted. Spike, Spike! Holt's voice, and it was a different voice now. All the swagger burned out of it in an instant, replaced by something raw and animal. Vanguard, I have a mud spike. We've got an active SAM site locking us up. The shrill electronic scream of a threat warning receiver tore through the open mic, bleeding into the speakers, filling the command center with a sound like the world's worst alarm clock. Missile launch, missile launch. That was Cole now, Grizzly, his flat, unshakable voice cracking for the first time Claire had ever heard. Break right, rookie. The main radar screen lit up, not with one threat. 3. Red vectors tearing up out of the canyon floor, arrowing toward the 4 green blips at speeds that made the math almost obscene. A textbook ambush. Wait until the prey is boxed in by stone walls. Turn on the radar. Fire. Panic detonated across the room like a second explosion. Sanders froze at his console, hands hovering uselessly above the keyboard, mouth opening and closing with nothing coming out. A fish gasping on dry land. Grant grabbed the mic himself, knuckles white. "Vanguard, what is our out?" Holt screaming now, the G-forces of his evasive turn audible in the strain of his own voice. "Give me a vector. A ghost lead. Deploy countermeasures and climb." Sanders stammered, voice cracking on every third word. "Climb." The word hit Claire like ice water down her spine. Because if they climbed above the canyon rim, they'd silhouette themselves against open sky. Perfect targets. Perfect silhouettes for radar that had been waiting, patient and hungry, for exactly this mistake. Ghost 2 is hit. Briggs young, terrified, his voice climbing an octave with every word. "I'm hit. Lost my right horizontal stabilizer. Trailing smoke. I can't shake it. Another one's tracking me." Grant shoved Sanders bodily out of the chair, grabbed the mic himself. "Ghost flight. This is Vanguard Actual. Punch out. Eject, rookie. Negative. If we eject down here, they'll butcher us." Briggs was hyperventilating now, the sound raw and animal through the speakers, his jet visibly shuddering across the telemetry feed. "I've got 20 seconds to impact." 20 seconds. Claire watched the red lines converging on the green blips like something out of a nightmare she'd already lived once. The pilots were dumping chaff, flares, everything they had but the SA-15's backup optical tracking was ignoring every decoy, locked and patient and merciless. 3 men trapped in a bowl of granite, bleeding airspeed with every desperate turn, completely blind to where the next shot was coming from. 15 seconds. Claire stopped thinking. The camouflage she'd worn for 3 years, the scrunchie, the coffee pot, the yes sir, no sir, the whole careful architecture of invisibility she'd built, brick by brick, fell away in the space of a single heartbeat. She lunged, grabbed Colonel Grant by the shoulder, physically hauled him backward, out of the chair, out of the way, out of her way. "Hey, what the hell are you?" Grant staggered, stumbling into a console. Claire didn't answer him. Didn't have time. She dropped into the JTAC seat, slammed the transmit toggle, bypassed the encryption delay entirely, and hardwired herself straight onto the tactical frequency. Ghost flight. Her voice cracked through the speakers like a whip. Not the soft, submissive whisper of the coffee girl anymore. Something else entirely. Something cold and commanding and absolute. "Shut up and listen to me." High above the desert, inside a cockpit, shuddering with the violence of his own evasive turns, Derek Holt heard a voice he didn't recognize cut across every frequency he had. "Who the hell is this?" he shouted. "Vanguard, get me a real controller." "Ghost lead, this is Vanguard control." The voice again. Calm, terrifyingly calm given the chaos screaming through his headset. "You are dragging them into your own flares. Roll inverted. Pull 80 degrees down. Throttle back to idle." "Idle?" Holt's voice cracked with disbelief. "Are you insane? If I drop speed, I'm dead." Silence answered him. A silence that somehow carried more weight than any shouted order ever could. Then the voice again. Slower this time, each word landing like a stone. "Captain Holt, this is Valkyrie. You will cut your throttle. You will pull 0G, and you will do it right now." The cockpit went absolutely silent, save for the shriek of the missile alarm. Because every fighter pilot in the United States Air Force had heard that name. 5 years ago, during a night raid so catastrophic it had become legend, before the after-action report even finished printing, a lone F-16 had stayed behind to cover a downed rescue helicopter. That pilot had drawn the fire of 6 separate SAM batteries, dodged missiles in total darkness for 45 minutes, on nothing but raw instinct and maneuvers most instructors called suicidal. That pilot had saved 30 men and vanished into rumor, afterward grounded. Everyone said, permanently, injuries too severe to fly again. Holt's hands moved before his brain caught up to them. "Valkyrie," he breathed. He snapped his F-16 inverted, shoved the throttle to idle, pushed the nose down into a dive that should have terrified him, and somehow, impossibly, didn't. Ghost 3 Grizzly. Claire's voice again, not missing a beat, already moving to the next threat. "Radars on the southern ridge, elevation 4,000. You have a missile off your left wing." Split S, dump a wall of chaff and notch him right. Put the radar exactly at your 3 o'clock, copy. Cole's voice, flat even now, even with death a half-second away, ripping his jet into a brutal 9G turn that would leave bruises across his ribs for a week. In the TOC, Claire watched the geometry shift on the screen exactly the way she'd known it would. Holt's dive dropped his heat signature just enough that his flares became the hotter target. The missile snapped off course, missed by a margin so thin it might as well have been luck, and detonated harmlessly against the canyon wall in a burst of orange fire. Holt, you're clear. Claire's voice, sharp as a blade. Firewall the throttle. Climb to Angels 15. Valkyrie. Rookie's crippled. Holt, pulling his own jet up hard, breathless. He's losing altitude, and they just launched 2 more off the rails. Claire's eyes darted to Briggs's telemetry. Engine pressure dropping. Hydraulics bleeding out. He couldn't turn. He was a sitting duck at 500 miles an hour, and 2 missiles were already carving through the sky toward him, with a certainty that made Claire's chest go tight. Rookie. Claire's voice softened, just slightly, just enough. A lifeline dropped into the dark. Listen to me. You can't outturn them. You have to outthink them. I need you to fly straight at the mountain. What? Briggs was sobbing now, fighting the stick with hands that didn't want to obey him. I'll crash. You won't crash, Tyler. Claire used his first name without thinking, without planning to, and something about it seemed to reach him in a way Rank never could have. You're going to use the mountain's shadow to break the radar lock. Keep the nose level. Wait for my mark. Behind her, Colonel Grant stood frozen. Sanders sat stunned in the wreckage of his own uselessness. The entire TOC had gone dead silent, every eye fixed on the back of a small blonde woman orchestrating a symphony of survival in the sky like she'd been doing it her whole life. Because she had. Missiles at 3 miles. Briggs's voice cracking apart. 2 miles. Hold. Claire's eyes never left the screen, visualizing the canyon wall rushing toward Briggs's jet at 500 miles an hour, with the kind of clarity that felt almost like déjà vu. Like she'd lived this exact moment before. Because in a way, God help her, she had. Hold, pull up, Tyler, she shouted. Pull hard now. Briggs yanked the stick back with everything he had left. The crippled F-16 screamed upward, belly scraping close enough to the jagged granite that later he would swear he'd felt rock dust on the canopy. The 2 missiles, lacking the jet's proximity sense, couldn't correct in time. They slammed directly into the mountain face instead, detonating in a massive fireball of dirt and shattered stone. I'm clear, Briggs gasped, jet screaming straight up into open blue sky, finally away from the kill box. I'm clear. Cheers broke out across the TOE. Technicians leapt from their chairs. Grant let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a decade. Claire didn't celebrate. Her jaw stayed tight. Her eyes stayed on the screen. Because the green blips were safe now, clear of the canyon, but the mission wasn't over. Not even close. Because somewhere below them, on a desert floor scarred with dust and heat, a new kind of danger was already stirring. Valkyrie, this is Ghost Lead. Holt's voice again, and there was something in it now that had never been there before. Reverence. Actual reverence, aimed at the woman who 12 minutes ago had been pouring his coffee. We're out of the envelope. But Rookie's engine is flaming out. He's not going to make it back to Ironhold. He has to eject over the hostile zone. Claire pulled up the satellite feed with hands that had gone perfectly steady again. All the trembling burned away by adrenaline and purpose. Below Briggs's altitude, dust plumes were already kicking up across the desert floor, technicals. Pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, 4 of them, cutting a coordinated line straight toward the projected impact zone. They'd seen the dogfight. They knew exactly where a downed American pilot was about to land, and they were racing to claim him before rescue could arrive. Vanguard, we're bingo fuel and out of air-to-ground ordnance. Holt's voice, tight with a desperation that mirrored the tightening in Claire's own chest. We can't cover him. If Rookie punches out, those trucks reach him in 10 minutes. They'll take him alive. Claire pulled the headset off slowly, turned to face Colonel Grant. The base commander was staring at her like he'd never actually seen her before. Because he hadn't. Not really. He'd been looking at a comms tech for 2 years, and somehow completely missed the predator hiding underneath. "Colonel," her voice had gone cold, absolutely level. "There's a spare F-16 on the tarmac, tail number 402. "It's grounded," Grant said, almost reflexively. "Avionics glitch in the fire control radar." "There's no glitch." Claire didn't blink. "The maintenance crew misaligned the inertial nav during the last sweep. Takes 90 seconds to hard reset. It's fully fueled. It's loaded with 6 CBU-87 cluster bombs." Grant swallowed hard. "You haven't flown in 3 years, Jenkins." He caught himself. Corrected. "Ashford. You don't have flight clearance." Claire reached under her t-shirt, gripped the black taped dog tags hidden against her chest, and pulled them free. Silver flashed dull under the fluorescent lights of the TOC. "If that kid hits the sand," she said, "he's a dead man, and I am not writing another letter to another mother." She didn't ask permission. She stated a fact, and then she walked toward the door. "Get me a helmet." The flight line at Ironhold shimmered under a blistering midday sun, heat rolling off the concrete in waves thick enough to bend the horizon. Master Sergeant Ray Coleman, chief mechanic for the 104th, elbow deep in the landing gear of a grounded A-10, didn't even hear the base siren start until the vibration of a utility jeep screaming across the tarmac rattled through the ground beneath his boots. He wiped grease from his forehead just in time to watch it screech to a halt inches from F-16 tail number 402. His jaw dropped, because out of the driver's seat sprang the quiet blonde girl from the TOC, the coffee girl, dragging a high-altitude G-suit in one hand and a standard-issue flight helmet in the other, like she'd done this 10,000 times before. "Jenkins." Coleman was already moving, already shouting, already certain this made no sense at all. "What in the hell are you doing on the active line?" "That Viper is grounded." Claire didn't look at him. She threw the G-suit onto the blazing concrete and stepped into it with a kind of mechanical precision that made something in Coleman's gut go very still. Zip, snap, cinch. Movements too fast, too fluent, too practiced to belong to a woman who'd never flown a fighter jet in her life. "I need the auxiliary power unit online, Master Sergeant." Her voice cut through the heat, flat and certain, "and I need the chocks pulled now." "Are you out of your mind? You're a comms tech. I'll have MPs drag you to the brig." Claire finally turned, locked eyes with him. Coleman had spent 22 years around fighter pilots. He knew that look, had seen it exactly twice before in his entire career, and both times it had belonged to men who came home from missions nobody else survived. He was seeing it now on a woman he'd underestimated for 2 solid years. "Coleman." Her voice dropped lower. "Steadier. Rookies punching out over Sector Charlie. Hostile technicals 3 miles from his drop zone. I am the only pilot on this base with a fueled jet who can get there before they skin him alive." She strapped the helmet on, visor still up, eyes never leaving his. "I am hard resetting the inertial nav. You have 30 seconds to pull those chocks before I throttle up and blow them through the blast wall. Your call." Coleman's eyes flicked from her to the blinking red light on the TOC tower behind her. Back to her. He didn't understand it, couldn't have explained it if his life depended on it. But he recognized command presence when it slapped him in the face, and this, whatever this was command presence like he'd rarely felt from anyone. "You'll kill yourself," he muttered. But he turned, gave the hand signal to his crew. "Pull the chocks. Spin the APU." Claire scrambled up the boarding ladder 2 rungs at a time. The moment she dropped into the ejection seat, the smell hit her aviation fuel, stale sweat, electrified oxygen, that particular chemical sharpness that lived permanently in the back of a fighter cockpit. It was a smell that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years straight. Her right arm, the one wrapped in scar tissue, thick and pale and unmistakable, throbbed with a phantom ache so sudden and so violent it nearly stole her breath. Because this cockpit, this exact smell, this exact heat pressing down through the canopy, it was the same as that night, the same as the fire. Because until she buried it, until she shoved the memory down somewhere deep enough that it couldn't reach her hands, couldn't shake her fingers on the controls, couldn't cost Tyler Briggs his life the way it had already cost her. No. Stop. Not now. She pushed the pain down, buried it under a mountain of adrenaline and purpose, and the simple, undeniable fact that a 23-year-old kid was falling out of the sky right now, alone, terrified, with hostile trucks racing toward the exact patch of desert where he was about to land. Her hands moved across the multifunction displays, bypassing the standard 15-minute startup checklist in under 40 seconds, muscle memory, doing what conscious thought couldn't, fingers finding switches they hadn't touched in 3 years like no time had passed at all. The Pratt & Whitney F-100 engine roared awake beneath her, a low vibrating growl that shook the entire airframe and rattled up through the seat into her spine. The canopy lowered, locked with a hiss that sealed her off from the rest of the world. She was Valkyrie again. Vanguard Tower, this is Valkyrie 1-1. Her transmission cut across the tower frequency, calm, certain, her thumb already resting naturally against the stick like it had never left. Taxiing runway 29er for immediate unrestricted climb. Colonel Grant's voice crackled back through her headset, and for the first time since she'd known him, it carried something close to awe. Godspeed, Valkyrie. Pedro 6-6 is wheels up for the rescue, but they're 20 minutes out. You have to hold the line. Claire didn't wait for clearance. She pushed the throttle past military power and straight into full afterburner. The F-16 surged forward like a chained animal finally let loose, G-forces slamming her back into the seat as the jet devoured the runway and tore into the desert sky at a near-vertical 60-degree climb. Below her, Ironhold shrank into a smear of concrete and dust. Ahead of her, somewhere over the horizon, a 23-year-old boy was fighting for his life in a dry riverbed. And Claire Ashford Valkyrie, daughter of a man whose death had never quite made sense to her, a woman who'd spent 3 years learning how to disappear, pointed her jet toward the fight and didn't look back once. 50 miles away, Lieutenant Tyler Briggs was having the worst day of his short life. His parachute had dumped him hard into a dry riverbed, dragging him across sharp, unforgiving scree before he'd managed to punch the quick release. He scrambled upright, gasping, ribs bruised, ankle twisted at an angle that made his stomach lurch when he put weight on it. Above him, smoking wreckage from his crippled Viper scattered across a jagged ridgeline, orange flame still licking at torn metal. But the silence of the desert didn't last long. A low rumble built across the ground, a vibration he felt in his teeth before he heard it. Briggs drew his sidearm with hands shaking so badly he could barely keep his grip steady on the polymer frame. Cresting the dunes to the east, 4 trucks, technicals, kicking up massive rooster tails of dust, moving in a coordinated tactical wedge that spoke of practice, of purpose, of men who had done this before and knew exactly what they wanted. Mounted in the truck beds, heavy machine guns swung slowly toward his position. Vanguard, this is Rookie. His voice cracked as he keyed his survival radio, backing hard against a boulder that suddenly felt very small. Hostiles closing. Range 500 meters. I am about to be overrun. A ragged breath. Tell my mother I love her. Hold your ground, Rookie. A woman's voice answered. The comms girl. Except the voice was entirely different now. A voice that seemed to command the sky itself. Keep your head down. The lead technical closed to 100 yards. Briggs could see faces now. Mouths open in shouted triumph. Rifles waving overhead. They knew he was cornered. They knew this was already over. A burst of heavy machine gun fire chewed the dirt 3 feet from his boots, sprayed him with hot gravel that stung against his face. Briggs squeezed his eyes shut, raised his pistol, prepared for the end. A sonic boom cracked the sky wide open. The shock wave knocked him flat onto his back, ears ringing, dust exploding around him in every direction. A sleek gray shape tore out of the blinding sun, so low, it dragged its own localized sandstorm behind it. Jet wash flattening scrub brush for 100 yards in every direction. Before the insurgents could even process the sudden violence overhead, Claire depressed the weapon's release. Cluster munitions away, she breathed, pulling the stick hard right, hauling the jet out of the dive with a G-force that pressed her deep into the seat. 2 CBU-87 canisters dropped from her wing pylons, snapped open at 300 feet, dispensing hundreds of bomblets across the advancing convoy in a wide lethal pattern. The desert erupted. A rolling wave of fire vaporized the lead-2 trucks instantly. Metal and dust hurled skyward in a fireball that swallowed the horizon. The blast wave caught the third vehicle mid-turn, flipped it end over end, left it a mangled, smoking wreck against the sand. Only the fourth truck managed to swerve clear, skidding behind a rocky outcropping. "Scratch 3 targets," Claire reported, looping her jet around for another pass, eyes scanning the ground with a coldness that would have terrified her 3 years ago and now felt like nothing but purpose. "Rookie status." Briggs coughed, wiping dust off his visor, staring up at the sky like he'd witnessed a miracle. "I'm alive." A disbelieving laugh tore out of him. "Jesus Christ, Valkyrie, I'm alive. Don't get comfortable." Her voice snapped, sharp again, scanning. "You've still got dismounted infantry moving on your position from the surviving truck, and I have—" She never finished the sentence. Her radar warning receiver screamed to life, a high staccato tone filling her helmet, deedle deedle deedle, urgent and wrong, in a way that made her stomach drop through the floor of the cockpit. Not a surface-to-air missile. Anti-aircraft artillery. A ZZ-23 twin-barreled autocannon, hidden on a ridge overlooking the riverbed, and it was already tracking her. Thick glowing tracer rounds the size of soda cans tore through the airspace inches from her canopy. "Valkyrie, you're taking heavy fire from your 4 o'clock. Grant's voice, warning, sharp with alarm through her headset. "Abort the gun run. Get to altitude." "Negative, Vanguard." Claire's teeth clenched. "If I pull up, they turn that autocannon on Rookie and turn him into a fine mist. I have to draw their fire." And there it was. The exact scenario. The one that had ended her career 3 years ago, roasted the flesh clean off her forearm, given her nightmares that never fully let go no matter how many months passed between them. Because this was it. This was the moment. Her body already screaming at her, except she couldn't stop, couldn't pull away, couldn't let history repeat itself with a different pilot dying in the sand below her while she saved herself instead. Because that wasn't who she was. That had never once been who she was, not even in the worst 30 seconds of her entire life. The panic rose anyway, a dark, suffocating wave threatening to close over her head, ghost flames licking at her forearm, even though the fire had died 3 years ago, even though there was nothing burning now but memory. She forced it down. She wasn't the victim today. She was the weapon. Claire rolled the F-16, completely inverted, dropped her altitude to a suicidal 200 feet, pushed the throttle, and screamed across the desert floor at 600 knots. The AAA gunners tracked her, filled the sky with a wall of lead, thick enough to see with the naked eye. "Come on." Her voice barely a whisper inside her own helmet. "Look at me, keep looking at me." She jinked left. Right. Violent, unpredictable. 7 Gs and then 8. The pressure crushing her chest, forcing air out of her lungs in a way that made her vision start to tunnel at the edges. G-lock. The onset of it, the darkness creeping in from the sides of her vision like curtains closing on a stage. She squeezed her leg muscles hard, forcing blood back toward her brain, doing the anti-G straining maneuver she hadn't practiced in 3 long years. "Hick, breathe! Hick, breathe! Valkyrie, Pedro 6-6 is on station." A new voice cracked over the radio, a Pave Hawk rescue helicopter, side-mounted miniguns already spinning up as it swooped low over the mountains. "Clear to engage the ridge, Pedro." "Copy," Claire gasped, pulling her jet straight up into the vertical just as a line of tracer fire grazed her left wingtip, tearing a jagged hole through the aluminum skin. The Pave Hawk didn't hesitate. A solid beam of red light poured from its miniguns, sweeping across the rocky air ridge in a hail of 4,000 rounds a minute. The ZSU-23 went silent almost instantly, its position vanishing into a cloud of dust and smoke. Below, 2 parasescue jumpers fast-roped from the hovering chopper straight down into the riverbed, grabbed Briggs, hoisted him bruised and shaking into the safety of the cabin. "Valkyrie, we have the package." Pedro's pilot, calm now that the worst had passed. "Rookie's secure. We are RTB." Claire let out a breath that had been trapped in her chest for what felt like a lifetime. Her hand trembled violently on the throttle, adrenaline crashing now, leaving behind a hollow, cold exhaustion she recognized from another life. Copy Pedro, her voice quieter now, almost human again. Valkyrie's bingo fuel. Returning to Ironhold, the flight back was silent. No chatter on the tactical net. Nothing but the low hum of engines and the enormous, echoing quiet of everyone at Ironhold who'd listened to every second of that radio traffic and hadn't fully processed what they'd just witnessed. When Claire's battle-damaged F-16 touched down on the runway, the base was eerily still. She taxied to the ramp, cut the engine, let the canopy rise, heat rolling over her in a wave that felt, for the first time all day, almost gentle. She unbuckled her harness. Her right arm shook so badly she could barely unhook her own oxygen mask. Slowly, carefully, she climbed down the ladder. Waiting for her on the tarmac wasn't military police. It was the entire squadron. Captain Derek Holt stood at the front, flight suit soaked through with sweat, face still pale from his own brush with death in the canyon. Behind him, Major Nathan Cole. Behind them, dozens of mechanics, technicians, pilots, every soul on that flight line who had heard her voice guide 3 men out of certain death and 1 man out of an ambush that should have killed him twice over. Holt stepped forward, looked at the quiet girl who'd poured his coffee 4 hours ago, looked at the heavy burn scars visible now past the rolled-up sleeves of her flight suit, scars he'd never once noticed in 2 years of walking past her. He swallowed hard. Something in his face, his ego, his swagger, the whole careful architecture of a man who believed himself untouchable cracked wide open. Slowly, deliberately, Captain Derek Holt raised his right hand into a crisp, perfect salute. Behind him, Major Cole did the same. Then Master Sergeant Coleman. Then one by one, every man and woman on that flight line snapped to attention, holding their salute in absolute, pin-drop silence. The highest form of respect a pilot could ever earn. A silent acknowledgement of something undeniable. Claire didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply reached up, adjusted the frayed scrunchie holding back her hair, and returned the salute with a tired, precise motion that belonged to a soldier, not a comms tech. Then she turned and started walking back toward the Teok. There were radios that needed calibrating, but Master Sergeant Ray Coleman didn't move. He stood on that tarmac long after the others had broken formation, long after the cheering had started up somewhere behind him, long after Claire's small frame had disappeared through the TOC doors. Something was nagging at him. Something about the shape of that ambush, the timing of it, the exact frequency the enemy radar had used, because Coleman had been at Ironhold a long time, longer than most, long enough to remember another mission, 5 years back, before this base had even been called Ironhold. A mission where a legendary pilot had gone down in almost the exact same pattern, a canyon, a hidden SAM site, a radar signature that had never quite made sense in the official report. A pilot named Robert Ashford, call sign Reaper. Coleman's jaw tightened. He turned and walked, slow at first, then faster, toward the maintenance shed where the old mission archives were kept in dust-covered filing boxes nobody had touched in years. Because if he was right, if the numbers in his head matched the numbers he was about to pull from that file, then today's ambush wasn't a coincidence. It was a repeat performance, and somebody at Ironhold, or somewhere far above it, had used the exact same playbook twice. He found the box, tore through it with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time in longer than he could remember, pulled the old after-action report, yellowed at the edges, stamped classified across the top in fading red ink. His eyes scanned the coordinates, the frequency, the elevation of the ridge where the radar had been positioned. His blood went cold. It was the same, not similar, the same down to the decimal point, down to the exact elevation marker, like whoever had planned today's ambush had pulled the coordinates directly out of a file that should have been buried in a vault somewhere and forgotten by everyone except the handful of people who'd once loved the man who died there. Coleman sat down heavily on an overturned crate, the old file trembling in his hands. Because there was only one conclusion that made any sense at all. Somebody who knew exactly what happened to Robert Ashford 5 years ago, somebody who had access to that classified report, had helped set today's trap, which meant the man who killed Claire's father wasn't gone. He was still here, maybe still on this base, and Claire didn't know it yet. Didn't know that the fire that had taken her father, and nearly taken her, hadn't been an accident at all. Didn't know that the scars she carried under that flight suit were about to mean something far darker than anyone at Ironhold had ever imagined. Coleman closed the file, pressed it flat against his chest like he was trying to keep something from escaping. Then he stood and started walking toward the talk, because Claire Ashford deserved to know the truth, even if the truth was about to tear her whole world apart all over again. The salute ended, but nothing else did, because heroes don't get to walk away clean. Not really. Not when the ground they just saved is still smoking behind them, and not when the man closest to the truth is standing in a maintenance shed with a file that's about to detonate everything. Claire Ashford thought she understood about her own life. Coleman didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. He sat in his quarters with the classified report spread across his knees, reading the same coordinates over and over until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a confession. Because coincidence didn't work like this. Coincidence didn't repeat itself down to the decimal point, 5 years apart, in a war that had 1,000 other ridgelines it could have used instead. Somebody had chosen this one. On purpose. Twice. Claire found him there at 0200, standing outside the 2 with the file pressed flat against his chest, like it might try to escape if he loosened his grip. She'd come looking for coffee. Found something else instead. Coleman, her voice rough with exhaustion. You look like you saw a ghost. Maybe I did. Something in his tone stopped her cold, because Coleman didn't talk like that. 22 years of fixing broken jets had scraped every ounce of drama out of the man. He was steel and grease and blunt honesty. Nothing more, nothing less. Which was exactly why the look on his face terrified her. What is that? She nodded at the file in his hands. Not a question. A demand dressed up as one. Coleman hesitated, and in that hesitation Claire felt something cold slide down her spine, the same cold she'd felt hours earlier watching an X-band signal bleed onto a screen that was supposed to be empty. You should sit down, he said. I don't want to sit down. I want to know why my chief mechanic is standing outside my TOC at 2 in the morning, holding a file like it's a live grenade. Coleman exhaled. Long. Slow. The kind of breath a man takes right before he says something he can't take back. Because I think I know why that SAM site was waiting for ghost flight today, he said. And I don't think it was random. Claire's jaw tightened. Explain 5 years ago. Coleman's voice dropped low. Different canyon. Different squadron. Same frequency. Same elevation marker. Same radar signature down to the decimal. The world tilted sideways beneath Claire's feet. Because she already knew what mission he was talking about. She'd have known it blindfolded, deaf, half-conscious. She'd have known it from a single word. Reaper, she whispered. Coleman nodded once. Grim, your father's mission. Claire didn't remember walking into the maintenance shed, didn't remember sitting down. One moment, she was standing on the tarmac, and the next, she was staring at a yellowed report with her father's call sign stamped across the header in fading government ink, and somewhere in between those 2 moments, 3 years of carefully built silence cracked straight down the middle. Because she'd spent 3 years believing her father's death was exactly what the official report said it was. Pilot error, a tragic, unavoidable accident, a radar malfunction nobody could have predicted, in a canyon nobody could have known was hostile. That's what they'd told her at the funeral. That's what they'd told her when they signed her own discharge papers. 8 months later, her arms still wrapped in gauze, her voice still raw from the smoke she'd swallowed, trying to drag her father's wingman clear of the wreckage. Pilot error. 2 words. Clean. Simple. Words that closed a file and let everyone else go home and sleep at night. Except now Coleman was sitting across from her with a report that said something entirely different. Read the coordinates, he said quietly. Claire's hands shook as she took the file. Because until this exact moment, she'd never once seen the actual mission data. From that night, nobody had shown it to her. Nobody had let her see it. Not the grieving daughter, not the injured survivor, not the woman everybody decided was too broken to be trusted with the truth of her own father's death. Her eyes scanned the page, and there it was. The same elevation, The same frequency signature. A SAM emplacement in a canyon that intelligence had sworn, with absolute confidence, was empty. Just like today. This is the same trap, Claire whispered. Somebody used the same trap twice. Which means somebody who had access to your father's classified file 5 years ago, Coleman said slowly, is still active. Still here. Or close enough to feed today's ambush the exact same intelligence. Claire's stomach turned over, because the implications were spreading out in front of her, now like cracks racing across ice, faster than she could process them, faster than she wanted to. That's not possible, she said, but her voice didn't believe itself. I wish it wasn't. Radar malfunction. Claire's hands tightened on the file until the edges crumpled. That's what they told me. A radar malfunction on his jet. Not an ambush. Not a trap someone planned, Claire. Coleman's voice softened, and it was the gentlest she'd ever heard it. Look at the warning receiver logs. Page 4. She turned to page 4, and felt the floor drop away entirely, because the logs showed something that made absolutely no sense. Her father's radar warning receiver, the system designed to scream at the first hint of enemy radar, the system that had saved her own life today in that exact same canyon type, had been offline, not malfunctioning, disabled, manually, deliberately, sometime in the 90 minutes before the mission launched, according to the maintenance timestamp buried at the bottom of the page. Claire read it 3 times. 4. Each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less horrifying. They didn't. Somebody disabled his warning system before he ever left the ground, she said. Flat. Hollow. Like the words belonged to somebody else's mouth. That's what it looks like. Which means he never had a chance. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. Hated the way 3 years of composure shattered in a maintenance shed at 2 in the morning over a piece of paper she'd been forbidden to see. He flew into that canyon blind. On purpose. Somebody sent him in blind. Coleman didn't answer. Didn't need to. The silence said enough. Claire's hands had gone numb around the edges of the file. Because, except this changed everything. Except this meant her father hadn't made a mistake, hadn't misjudged a threat, hadn't done anything at all except trust the machine and the men around him, the way you were trained to trust them. Somebody had murdered him, and buried it so deep, so carefully, that his own daughter had spent 3 years grieving a lie. Who? Claire said, barely audible. Who had access to disable a warning system and rewrite an after-action report. Somebody with rank, Coleman said. Somebody with clearance high enough to bury it. That's not a mechanic's job, Claire. That's not even a squadron commander's job. That's somebody a lot higher up the chain. Claire's eyes lifted from the page, found his. And that somebody just did it again, she said. Today. Coleman nodded, slow, grim. Which means whoever it is, Claire said, voice rebuilding itself into something hard and clear, is either still on this base, or close enough to reach it. She stood. The chair scraped against the concrete floor, loud in the silence. I want to know who, she said, and I want to know before they get the chance to do it a 3rd time. Sleep didn't come easy after that. It never really had, not since the fire, but that night was worse. Because every time Claire closed her eyes, she saw her father's cockpit filling with an alarm that never sounded, saw him flying blind into a canyon that had already decided to kill him before his wheels ever left the runway, saw 30 seconds of a man's entire life reduced to a maintenance timestamp nobody was ever supposed to read. She lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling until the light outside her window turned from black kind to gray, to the pale gold of another blistering desert morning, and somewhere in that long, sleepless dark, something inside her hardened into resolve. Because grief was one thing. Grief you could survive, could bury, could learn to carry quietly for years, without anyone noticing the weight of it. But this wasn't grief anymore. This was a murder investigation, and she was the only person on this entire base who had both the motive and the means to solve it. Captain Derek Holt found her at the coffee machine the next morning, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't ask her to pour it for him. He poured out a second cup. You look like hell, he said. Thanks. I mean that as a compliment. He leaned against the counter, studying her with an expression she'd never seen from him before. Something careful, almost respectful. You saved my life yesterday, and Grizzlies, and Rookies, and I spent 2 years calling you Radio Girl. Claire took the cup. Didn't quite meet his eyes. You didn't know, she said. That's not an excuse. Holt should have looked closer. Everybody should have looked closer. People don't look closely at things they've already decided don't matter. The words came out sharper than she intended. Holt flinched, just slightly, and Claire almost apologized before deciding she didn't want to. Because she was done apologizing for being underestimated. I want to help, Holt said instead. Whatever this is, whatever's going on. I heard Coleman was in your face at 2 a.m. with some old file. Claire's eyes snapped up. Word travels fast, she said. This is a base full of people with nothing to do at 2 a.m. except gossip. Holt shrugged. So, what's the file? Claire studied him for a long moment, weighing whether Derek Holt, arrogant, careless, the man who'd made her invisibility a running joke for 2 years straight, had actually earned the right to know what she was about to tell him. She decided, against every instinct she had, that maybe he had. Somebody murdered my father, she said. 5 years ago. Made it look like pilot error. And I think whoever did it just used the exact same playbook on you and Grizzly and Rookie yesterday. Holt's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Say that again, he said quietly. She did, and watched every trace of arrogance drain out of his face, replaced by something colder. Something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely dangerous. Then we're going to find out who, Holt said. It took 3 days to build a list. 3 days of Claire, pulling old personnel files, under the cover of routine communications maintenance, cross-referencing clearance levels against deployment dates, quietly asking Coleman to check maintenance logs. Nobody should have had reason to alter twice. 5 years apart, on 2 completely different aircraft, in 2 completely different squadrons. The list started long. Anyone with clearance high enough to access classified after-action reports. Anyone stationed at Ironhold 5 years ago, who was also stationed here now. Anyone with the technical knowledge to disable a radar warning receiver without leaving an obvious trace. 3 days of narrowing, until the list held exactly one name that made Claire's stomach turn cold every time she looked at it. Lieutenant Eric Sanders. Because Sanders had been a junior enlisted technician 5 years ago, working comms exactly where Claire worked now, on the exact squadron her father had flown for, reassigned twice since then, each time landing him at a base right before something unexplainable happened. Reassigned to Ironhold 18 months ago, right before Claire arrived. She stared at his personnel file for a long time, the pieces sliding into place with a horrible clicking precision. Because Sanders had been the one at the JTAC console yesterday, the one who froze, the one who waved her off, told her not now, Jenkins, I'm busy, while an F-16 system tracked 4 American jets from a canyon floor that intelligence swore was empty. Was that incompetence? Or was that exactly what it was designed to look like? He was there, Claire said, mostly to herself, staring at the file spread across Coleman's workbench. He was right there when it happened, both times. And nobody ever thought to ask why. Because nobody was looking for a pattern, Coleman said. You were. That's the difference. Claire closed the file. Her hands, she noticed distantly, had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 3 days. Grief had a way of doing that, eventually burning itself down into something you could hold steady, something you could aim. I need proof, she said. Not a pattern. Proof. How do you get proof on a man who's had 5 years to cover his tracks? Claire's eyes narrowed, already turning the problem over in her mind the way she used to turn over threat vectors on a radar screen. Fast, cold, methodical. You watch him, she said, until he makes a mistake. They didn't have to wait long. 4 days after the ambush, Ironhold received word that a senior officer would be arriving within the week to review the incident personally, which, on paper, was standard procedure. Any engagement involving hostile SAM systems on American aircraft triggered an automatic review from higher command. But Claire noticed something the moment the notice came through. Sanders's reaction. She was in the TOC when the message arrived, ostensibly recalibrating a radio unit that didn't actually need recalibrating. watching Sanders out of the corner of her eye the way she'd learned to watch threat displays. Patient, unblinking, waiting for the pattern to break. And it did, because the moment Colonel Grant read the incoming officer's name aloud, General Marcus Whitfield, arriving in 6 days to personally oversee the review, Sanders's face went the color of old paper. Just for a second, just long enough. Then he caught himself, smoothed it over, nodded like the news meant nothing at all. But Claire had seen it, and once you saw fear like that on a man's face, you didn't unsee it. That night she told Coleman what she'd witnessed. He didn't seem surprised. Whitfield, Coleman repeated, testing the name like it tasted wrong in his mouth. I know that name. From where? Your father's mission. Coleman's brow furrowed, digging back through 5 years of memory. Whitfield wasn't a general then. Colonel, I think. He was the one who signed off on the final report. Ruled it pilot error before the investigation even finished. Claire went very still. He closed the case, she said slowly. Fast. Faster than anybody thought made sense at the time. There were people who wanted a deeper investigation. Whitfield shut it down. Said the evidence was conclusive. And now he's the one flying in to personally review an ambush that used his exact same playbook. Claire's voice had gone dangerously quiet. That's not oversight, Coleman. That's damage control. You think he's coming here to bury this the same way he buried your father's case? I think, Claire said, that Sanders looked like he'd seen a ghost the second he heard that name. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think Sanders answers to him. Which meant they had 6 days. 6 days to prove that a lieutenant nobody had ever suspected was feeding classified coordinates to whoever wanted Ghost Squadron dead. 6 days to connect that lieutenant to a general with enough rank and reach to make an entire investigation vanish the same way he'd made her father's disappear 5 years ago. 6 days, and every single hour of it mattered. Claire barely slept, barely ate. Spent every spare moment cross-referencing Sanders's communications logs against known enemy radio frequencies, looking for the kind of pattern that wouldn't show up in a casual glance, but would scream at anyone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Because she did know. She'd spent 3 years training her mind to catch exactly this kind of anomaly, buried under layers of routine traffic that looked innocent to everyone, except someone who understood radar signatures the way most people understood their own heartbeat. And on the 4th night, she found it. A transmission. Brief. Encrypted in a civilian frequency band that had no business showing up anywhere near a military comms log. Sent from Sanders's workstation. Time-stamped 19 minutes before Ghost Squadron had entered Widow's Pass. 19 minutes. Exactly enough time to relay a flight plan to whoever was waiting in that canyon. Claire sat frozen in front of the screen, staring at the timestamp until her eyes burned. Because until this exact second, some small stubborn part of her had wanted to be wrong. Had wanted Sanders to be nothing more than a nervous, overwhelmed junior officer who froze under pressure, nothing sinister, nothing planned. That hope died looking at a timestamp on a screen. She printed the log, folded it carefully, and went to find Colonel Grant. Grant didn't believe her at first, which, given everything, wasn't entirely unreasonable. He sat behind his desk with the printout in his hands, reading it 3 times, his face cycling through disbelief and denial, and something that looked almost like grief for an officer he'd trusted. This is circumstantial, he said finally. A stray transmission on the wrong frequency doesn't prove treason, Ashford. It proves he was in contact with someone outside Standard Command 19 minutes before an ambush that used my father's exact classified coordinates. Claire's voice stayed level, controlled, even as everything underneath it burned. How many coincidences do you need, Colonel? Grant set the paper down, rubbed a hand across his face, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. If you're right, he said slowly, this goes above Sanders. Way above him. I know. Which means we can't move on this quietly. Not through normal channels. I know that too. Grant studied her for a long moment, and Claire watched something shift behind his eyes, the last traces of a man who trusted intelligence, reports the way other men trusted gravity, finally cracking under the weight of proof he couldn't argue away. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to bring him in," Claire said, "before General Whitfield arrives. Before whoever's giving Sanders orders has a chance to clean this up the way they cleaned up my father's file." They moved that night. Grant assembled a small, trusted team. Coleman, 2 military police officers he'd vetted personally, Holt standing silent and grim near the door, because Claire had asked him to be there, and he hadn't hesitated for a second. They found Sanders in the comms shed alone, hunched over a terminal that he closed the second the door opened. "Too fast. Too guilty. Lieutenant Sanders." Grant's voice formal, cold. "Step away from the console." Sanders's face went white. "Colonel, I don't understand what." "Step away from the console," Grant repeated now. For a moment Claire thought he might actually run. Watched his eyes flick toward the door, toward the 2 MPs standing solid on either side of it, toward the narrow window that wouldn't have fit a grown man through it anyway. Then his shoulders sagged. All at once. Like something inside him had simply given up. "How much do you know?" he said quietly. "Enough," Claire said, stepping forward. "Enough to know you sent a transmission 19 minutes before Ghost Squadron flew into that canyon. Enough to know the coordinates matched a classified file from a mission 5 years ago. My father's mission." Sanders flinched at the word father like it had struck him physically. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to God, I didn't know it was your father's old case." "Nobody told me that part. But you knew you were feeding coordinates to somebody outside this base." Claire's voice stayed dangerously level. "You knew 4 American pilots could die because of what you sent." Sanders's eyes filled, and for a moment Claire almost felt something like pity for him. A young officer in over his head, caught in something much bigger than himself. Almost. "I didn't have a choice," Sanders whispered. "Everybody has a choice. Not when the man giving the orders can end your career with 1 phone call." Sanders's voice cracked. Not when he already ended somebody's life to prove he could. The interrogation room was small, windowless. A single overhead light that buzzed faintly, casting everything in a flat institutional glow that made every face in the room look tired in the same exact way. Sanders sat across the table, hands cuffed loosely in front of him, more out of procedure than genuine expectation that a 26-year-old lieutenant might attempt to fight his way past 2 armed MPs. Claire sat across from him, Grant beside her, Coleman leaning against the wall near the door, arms crossed, watching with an intensity that made Sanders visibly uncomfortable every time their eyes met. "Start from the beginning," Grant said. Sanders's jaw tightened. He looked down at his cuffed hands like they belonged to somebody else. 3 years ago, he began, I got pulled into something I didn't fully understand. A senior officer approached me, offered money, a lot of money, said all I had to do was pass along flight schedules sometimes. Nothing that would hurt anyone, he said. Just intelligence gathering. And you believed that, Claire said flatly. I wanted to believe that. Sanders's voice dropped. The money was good, better than good. My mother's medical bills were eating me alive, and this man, he knew that. He knew exactly what I needed to hear. What man? Claire said. Sanders hesitated. The silence stretched long enough that Coleman shifted off the wall, took a single step forward, and something about the movement finally broke whatever was left of Sanders's resistance. General Whitfield, he said. The name landed in the room like a physical weight. He wasn't a general then, Sanders continued, words spilling faster now, like a dam finally giving way after years of pressure. He was a colonel, working intelligence liaison for this whole sector. He had contacts everywhere, insurgent networks, arms dealers, people who paid well for advance warning on American flight patterns. Why? Grant said, voice tight with barely controlled fury. Why would an American officer sell out his own pilots? Money. Sanders let out a hollow laugh. It's always money, Colonel. Whitfield's been running this for years. Selling flight schedules, patrol routes, whatever intelligence he can get his hands on, to whoever pays. The insurgent networks get advance warning. American pilots get ambushed, and Whitfield gets rich enough to retire somewhere. Nobody will ever ask him a single question. Claire's hands, resting flat on the table, curled slowly into fists. My father found out, she said. Not a question. a certainty settling into place with terrible, clean precision. Sanders looked at her, and something in his expression finally cracked all the way open. Guilt. Real guilt, the kind that had been eating a man alive for years. "I don't know the details," he said quietly. "I wasn't involved yet, not back then. But I heard things, whispers mostly, that your father found irregularities in some patrol data, that he started asking questions Whitfield didn't want asked." A pause. "That he was going to report it." The room went utterly silent. "So Whitfield killed him," Claire said. Her voice came out flat, steady, terrifyingly calm, the way the eye of a storm is calm right before the second wall of wind arrives. "I believe so," Sanders whispered. "I believe he disabled the radar warning system and sent your father into a canyon he knew was compromised. And when the investigation started getting too close, he closed it himself. Ruled it pilot error before anyone could dig deeper." Claire sat back slowly in her chair, something enormous settling over her chest, pressing down until she could barely draw breath. 3 years. 3 years of grief built on a lie so carefully constructed that even the woman who loved her father most had believed it completely. "And this ambush," Grant said, voice low and dangerous. "The one 4 days ago, that was you too?" Sanders nodded, miserable. "Whitfield contacted me 2 weeks ago. Said he needed flight schedules for an upcoming operation. Widow's Pass. I didn't know he was planning to use the same coordinates as 5 years ago. I swear to you, I didn't know that part, until Ashford started asking questions about a file I never should have seen." "Why now?" Claire said. "Why repeat the exact same playbook?" Sanders looked at her, and for the first time, something like genuine confusion crossed his face. "I don't know," he admitted. Maybe arrogance. Maybe he thought nobody would ever connect the two. It worked once. I think he assumed it would work again. "Except this time," Claire said, "your father's daughter was sitting in the TOC when it happened." Sanders' eyes dropped to the table. "I didn't know that either," he said quietly. "Not until it was already too late to stop it." Grant stood, paced the small room once, twice, jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter he couldn't quite spit out. "General Whitfield arrives in 2 days," he said finally. "For a review he's flying in to personally oversee." "To bury it," Claire said. "Same as last time." "We need more than Sanders's confession," Grant said. "A confession from a man already caught red-handed won't hold up against a 2-star general with 30 years of spotless service record and half of Washington in his contact list." "Then we get more," Claire said. Grant turned to her. "How?" Claire's eyes drifted to Sanders, sitting hunched and broken across the table, a man who had just handed her the single most important piece of information she'd received in 3 years, and clearly had no idea what to do with the weight of it, now that it was out of him. "He's going to help us," she said, "whether he wants to or not." Sanders looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean Whitfield doesn't know we're onto him yet." Claire leaned forward, voice low, calculating in a way that made even Coleman shift uncomfortably by the door. "Which means he still thinks you're his asset. Still thinks he can trust you." "You want me to keep feeding him information," Sanders said slowly. "I want you to feed him exactly what we tell you to feed him. Nothing more." Claire's eyes never left his. "And when he arrives on this base thinking he's here to bury one more inconvenient truth, we're going to be ready with enough evidence to bury him instead." Sanders swallowed hard. "If he finds out I'm working against him, he'll do to you what he did to my father." Claire's voice stayed perfectly level, and somehow that flatness was more frightening than any shout could have been. "So don't let him find out." The room went quiet. Grant looked at her for a long moment. Something shifting in his expression, respect maybe, or something close enough to it, that Claire almost didn't recognize the emotion on his face, after 2 years of him barely acknowledging her existence. "This is dangerous," Grant said. "If Whitfield suspects anything before we have proof, he has the rank to shut this whole investigation down in an afternoon. Reassign every one of us. Bury the evidence permanently." "I know. And if he gets even a hint that you're the one leading this?" "I know that too." Claire's jaw set. "I've already lost my father to this man. I'm not walking away now because it's dangerous. 2 days. 2 days to build a trap sturdy enough to hold a general." Claire barely left the TA, running every scrap of Sanders's old communications against known patterns, cross-referencing dates against Whitfield's documented movements over the past 5 years, building a timeline so thorough it would be impossible for anyone, even a two-star general with friends in high places, to wave away as coincidence. Holt brought her coffee she didn't ask for and didn't drink. Cole sat with her some nights, saying nothing, just present in that quiet, steady way of his, a silent reassurance that she wasn't carrying this alone anymore. Coleman worked the mechanical side, quietly confirming, through old maintenance friends scattered across 3 different bases, that Whitfield's fingerprints touched at least 2 other unexplained incidents over the past several years. Different squadrons, different pilots, the same terrible pattern repeating itself in the dark for longer than anyone had realized. By the second night, Claire had built a file thick enough that even she was staggered by its weight. Because her father hadn't been an isolated tragedy. He'd been one name on a list that kept getting longer. The night before Whitfield's arrival, Claire found herself standing alone on the flight line, staring up at a sky thick with more stars than she'd ever get used to. No matter how many years she spent under a desert sky like this one, somewhere behind her, footsteps, familiar, heavy. Couldn't sleep either, Coleman said, coming to stand beside her. Haven't slept properly in 3 years, Claire admitted. Figured tonight wasn't going to break that streak. Coleman was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, like he was handling something fragile, "You know this doesn't bring him back. Even if we nail Whitfield to the wall tomorrow. Even if he goes down for everything he's done. It doesn't bring your father back. I know that. Then why does it feel like that's what you're chasing?" Claire's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, on the faint dark shape of Talon Ridge, cutting a jagged line against the stars. "Because for 3 years," she said quietly, "I believed my father made a mistake that killed him. I believed that every single day. And that kind of grief, Coleman, it eats you slow. Because you can't even be angry at anyone. You can only be angry at him. At a dead man who can't defend himself." She turned to face him. "Now I know the truth. And the truth doesn't bring him back. You're right about that." Her voice hardened. "But it means I get to be angry at the right person for once. And that matters more than you'd think." Coleman nodded slowly. Didn't argue. Because there wasn't anything left to argue with. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the flight line, unseen by either of them, Lieutenant Eric Sanders sat alone in the comms shed, staring at a blinking cursor on a screen. A message half-typed to a man who had orchestrated the death of a legendary pilot and nearly gotten away with doing it twice. His hands hovered over the keyboard, because, except he'd promised Ashford he wouldn't send anything without approval. Except every instinct, honed by 3 years of fear, was screaming at him that Whitfield would know something was wrong the second he arrived, would read it in every nervous glance, every hesitation, every wrong word. Sanders closed his eyes, thought about his mother's medical bills, thought about the money that had bought her 3 more years of treatment she never would have gotten otherwise, thought about the moment he'd first said yes to a colonel who'd promised him nothing that would hurt anyone. He'd been lying to himself for 3 years. He wasn't going to lie to himself anymore. Sanders deleted the message, closed the terminal, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he felt something close to relief settle into his chest. Whatever happened tomorrow, he was done being Whitfield's weapon. Dawn came gray and heavy, the kind of desert morning that promised heat long before the sun actually cleared the horizon. Ironhold stirred to life in its usual rhythm maintenance crews, walking the flight line. Pilots gathering for briefings, the low mechanical hum of a base that had, on the surface, returned to something resembling normal. But underneath that surface, everyone who knew the truth moved with a tension that hummed just beneath their skin. Colonel Grant stood at the edge of the runway at 0900, watching a small military transport plane bank in against the pale morning sky, its wheels already lowering for approach. Beside him, Claire stood in her dress uniform, for the first time in 3 years. Dog tags no longer hidden beneath her shirt, but resting openly against her collar, silver catching the early light. Because today, she wasn't going to hide. Not from anyone. You ready for this? Grant asked quietly, not looking away from the incoming aircraft. Claire's eyes tracked the transport plane's descent, watching it settle lower and lower toward the runway, carrying inside it the man who had murdered her father and nearly murdered an entire squadron, just to keep that first murder buried. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." The transport touched down, wheels screeching against the tarmac, engines winding down into a low mechanical growl. The door opened, and General Marcus Whitfield stepped out into the desert sun, utterly unaware that the woman standing at attention on that runway already knew every single secret he'd spent 5 years trying to bury. General Marcus Whitfield crossed the tarmac like a man who had never once been questioned in his life. 2 stars on his shoulders, a posture built from 30 years of rooms going quiet when he walked into them. Silver hair cropped military short, a jaw that had learned decades ago how to look carved from something colder than flesh. He smiled at Colonel Grant, shook his hand with exactly the right amount of pressure. The kind of handshake that had opened doors and closed investigations in equal measure for longer than Claire Ashford had been alive. And then his eyes slid past Grant, landed on her. For half a second less, really, barely a flicker, something moved behind Whitfield's expression. Because he was looking at dog tags resting openly against a woman's collar for the first time. Because those tags carried a name he recognized instantly, a name he'd spent 5 years believing was buried in a grave he'd helped dig with a single stroke of a pen. Ashford. His smile didn't waver, but Claire saw it anyway. That half-second flicker, the tiny crack in 30 years of practiced composure. She filed it away, because that flicker was the first piece of proof he couldn't explain his way out of. Colonel Grant. Whitfield's voice carried the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed before he finished a sentence. "I appreciate the reception. Let's get straight to business. I want a full walkthrough of the ambush timeline before lunch." "Of course, General." Grant's voice stayed perfectly level, and Claire silently thanked him for it, because underneath that calm she knew he was carrying the exact same weight she was. "This is Airman First Class Claire Ashford. She's the one who identified the threat and coordinated the response." Whitfield's eyes settled on her again. "Longer this time, Ashford." He said the name slowly, testing it. "Any relation to Colonel Robert Ashford?" "Call sign, Reaper." Claire's pulse hammered against her throat, because he'd said it like he already knew the answer. Like he was watching her, gauging her reaction, deciding in real time exactly how much she knew, and exactly how dangerous that made her. "He was my father," she said. Flat, steady, giving him nothing. Something shifted behind Whitfield's eyes. Calculation, maybe, or the first cold edge of concern. "Tragic loss," he said. "I remember that mission, reviewed the case myself, actually. Terrible business. Pilot error, if memory serves." "That's what the report says," Claire said. A pause. Small, almost invisible. "Reports don't lie, Airman," Whitfield said, and smiled again, that same easy, practiced smile that had probably talked its way out of 100 rooms far more dangerous than this one. Claire smiled back, because 2 could play that particular game. "No, sir," she said. "They don't." The review began exactly the way Claire had expected it to. Slow, methodical. Every question designed to sound thorough, while actually steering everyone in the room toward the same convenient conclusion. Unfortunate intelligence failure. Isolated incident. Nobody's fault. Case closed. Let's all go back to pretending this never happened. Whitfield sat at the head of the conference table, in the TOC's briefing room, flanked by 2 aides Claire had never seen before, both of them taking notes with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd done this exact job 100 times. "Walk me through the initial detection," Whitfield said, looking at Sanders now, and Claire watched the younger officer's hands tighten in his lap under the table where nobody but she could see them. Because this was it. The first test. Whitfield had no idea Sanders had already confessed everything. No idea the young lieutenant sitting across from him had spent the last 2 days helping build the exact case that was about to end his career and possibly his freedom. Sanders's voice caught, cleared his throat. "I picked up an unusual emission pattern on the spectrum analyzer. Alerted the team." "You alerted the team," Whitfield repeated. something almost amused in his tone. According to the initial incident report, it was Airman Ashford who flagged the threat. Not you. Sanders's jaw tightened. That's correct, sir. I was slow to act on it. Slow. Whitfield's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting choice of word. Claire kept her face perfectly still, because Whitfield was probing, testing the edges of the story, looking for the seam where it might come apart. He'd done this before. He was good at it. That was exactly what made him so dangerous. General. Claire's voice cut smoothly across the tension building in the room. If I may, the detection sequence is documented in full in the incident log. Would you like to review the raw data instead of the summary? Whitfield's eyes flicked to her. I would, he said slowly. Very much. They spent 2 hours in that room. 2 hours of Whitfield picking through every detail of the ambush with a precision that would have been impressive if Claire hadn't already known exactly what he was actually looking for. Not the truth. Never the truth. He was looking for the weak point in their story, the loose thread he could pull to unravel the whole thing and rebuild it into something safer for himself. But Claire had built this case too carefully. Every detail cross-referenced. Every log time-stamped and verified 3 separate ways. There was no loose thread to find, because she'd spent 3 sleepless nights making absolutely certain of that. By the time the session ended, Whitfield's easy smile had thinned into something tighter, something more careful. He knew. Claire could see it in the way his eyes lingered on her a beat too long as the room emptied out. Could see it in the slight tension along his jaw. A man recalculating, running numbers he didn't like the shape of. He knew that she knew. The only question left was what he intended to do about it. She found out that evening. Grant summoned her to his office at 1900 hours, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen on him before. Somewhere between anger and fear, the two emotions tangled together so tightly they'd become almost indistinguishable. Whitfield wants you reassigned, Grant said without preamble. Effective immediately. Transfer orders, already signed. You're to be on a transport out of Ironhold by 0600 tomorrow. Claire's stomach dropped. On what grounds? She said, though some cold, clear part of her already knew. Unauthorized use of military aircraft. Grant's voice was tight with restrained fury. He's citing the rescue mission. Says you took an aircraft without proper clearance, violated a dozen protocols, and while he's willing to overlook it given the circumstances, he thinks it's best for everyone if you're reassigned somewhere with his words closer supervision. He's trying to get me off this base before I can dig any deeper. I know that. Grant's jaw worked. And I can't stop it, Claire. He outranks me by 2 full grades. If I refuse to process those orders, he has the authority to relieve me of command and process them himself. Claire stood very still. Because until this exact moment, some small, stubborn part of her had believed the truth alone would be enough. That evidence, laid out clearly and honestly, would be sufficient to bring a man like Whitfield down. She understood now, watching Grant's face, exactly how naive that belief had been. Men like Whitfield didn't lose to evidence. They lost to exposure. Public, undeniable, impossible to bury exposure. And she had less than 12 hours to figure out how to create it. She found Coleman in the maintenance shed, exactly where she knew he'd be. He's transferring me out, she said, before Coleman could even ask. 0600 tomorrow. He knows we're onto him, and he's making his move before we can make ours. Coleman's face went hard. Then we move faster. With what? Claire's voice cracked, just slightly, exhaustion and fury, finally bleeding through the composure she'd held together for 2 straight days. We have Sanders's confession. We have my father's file. We have a stack of coincidences that would take a military tribunal weeks to properly investigate, and Whitfield's counting on the fact that we don't have weeks. He's counting on the fact that by tomorrow morning, I'll be halfway across the world, and this whole thing will quietly disappear the same way it disappeared 5 years ago. So we don't let him get you on that transport, Coleman said. He has orders, Coleman. Signed orders. Orders can be challenged. Coleman's eyes were steady, certain. Not by rank, but by evidence strong enough that even a general can't make it vanish quietly. You need something undeniable. Something public. Claire's mind raced, running through every scrap of intelligence she'd gathered over the past several days, searching for the one piece that could crack this whole thing wide open before sunrise. And then she remembered something. Something Sanders had said, almost in passing, during his confession. Something she'd noted, but hadn't fully understood the weight of, until this exact second. He said Whitfield's been running this for years, Claire said slowly, selling intelligence to multiple networks. Not just here, other bases too. That's what he said. Which means there's a financial trail. Claire's eyes lit with something sharp and dangerous. Money doesn't move invisibly, Coleman. Not for years. Not across multiple payments to multiple contacts. If Whitfield's been doing this as long as Sanders thinks he has, there's a paper trail somewhere. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, something. And you think you can find it. Tonight. I think, Claire said, I don't have any other choice. She worked through the night. Sanders brought quietly back into the fold, now that Whitfield's true intentions were laid bare, gave her everything he could remember. Account numbers he'd glimpsed once on a document he wasn't supposed to see. Names of contacts Whitfield had mentioned carelessly over the years, thinking a scared, compliant lieutenant would never dare repeat them. Claire cross-referenced every fragment against military financial disclosure records, against public sanctions databases, against anything she could access through channels that existed in the gray space between technically authorized and deeply not. By 0300, she had built the outline of something enormous. A financial network spanning 5 years, dozens of transactions funneled through at least 3 shell companies, registered in countries that asked very few questions about where money came from. Payments that lined up, with sickening precision, against dates when American patrol routes had been compromised across multiple bases, multiple squadrons, multiple tragedies that had all, conveniently, been ruled accidents. Her father's death wasn't an isolated crime. It was one transaction in a 5-year ledger of American lives sold for profit. Claire stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, until exhaustion and grief and fury tangled together into something that felt less like emotion and more like fuel. Because she finally understood the full shape of what she was fighting. And she had less than 3 hours to prove it, before a transport plane carried her away from the only chance she'd ever have to stop it. At 0430, she brought everything to Grant. He read through the file in silence, his face growing paler with every page, every transaction, every name that connected back, directly or indirectly, to General Marcus Whitfield. My God, he said finally, setting the pages down with hands that weren't quite steady. This is real. This is actually real. It's real, Claire confirmed. And it's enough to end him. But only if it reaches somebody outside his reach before he gets me on that transport and buries all of it the same way he buried my father's case. Grant's eyes lifted to hers. Who? He said. Who's outside his reach? Claire had already thought about this. Because a case this large, this damning, needed to land somewhere Whitfield couldn't touch it. Somewhere with the authority to act immediately and the independence to act without his interference. Inspector General's office, she said. Direct line. Not through normal channels. Those channels all eventually cross paths with people Whitfield's had 30 years to cultivate relationships with. This needs to go straight to the top, encrypted, with enough evidence attached that nobody can quietly shelve it. That's a massive risk, Grant said. If this gets intercepted before it reaches them. I know. If Whitfield finds out before it's transmitted. I know that too. Claire's jaw set. But sitting here doing nothing is a bigger risk. Because by 0600 I'm gone, and this evidence dies with my transfer orders. Grant studied her for a long moment, and Claire watched something settle behind his eyes, the last hesitation of a career officer finally choosing conscience over caution. Then we send it now, he said. Before he wakes up. They transmitted the file at 0457. Encrypted. Direct. Routed through channels Grant had spent 2 decades building trust in. Channels that existed specifically for moments like this, moments when the chain of command itself had been compromised from somewhere near the top. Claire watched the confirmation blink onto the screen. Sent, received. Acknowledged. and felt for the first time in 3 years something close to peace settle over her chest. Because whatever happened next, the truth was no longer trapped inside a maintenance shed and a handful of frightened, exhausted people at iron hold. It was out, moving through channels Whitfield couldn't reach, couldn't buy, couldn't threaten into silence. It was too late for him to bury it now. He just didn't know that yet. He found out at 05:30. Claire never learned exactly how, whether one of his aides intercepted a stray signal, whether some quiet ally inside the transmission chain tipped him off, whether he simply sensed, the way predators sometimes did, that something had shifted in the air around him. But by the time she walked toward the command building at 05:40, ready to face whatever came next, General Marcus Whitfield was already standing on the tarmac. Not calm anymore, not composed. His face had gone hard in a way she hadn't seen since he'd stepped off that transport plane, jaw tight, eyes sweeping the flight line with the sharp, hunted look of a man who understood, all at once, that his careful 5-year architecture of lies was collapsing faster than he could contain it. Ashford. His voice cut across the tarmac, stripped of every trace of the easy authority he'd worn like armor since the moment he'd arrived. A word. Claire stopped walking, stood her ground. General, I know what you sent. His voice dropped low, dangerous. I know exactly what you sent, and to whom, and I want you to understand something very clearly before this goes any further. I understand plenty, Claire said. I understand you disabled my father's radar warning system 5 years ago and sent him into a canyon you knew was compromised. I understand you closed the investigation yourself before anyone could look too closely. I understand you've been selling American lives for profit for at least 5 years, and I understand you tried to do it again 4 days ago, using the exact same coordinates, because apparently you never once imagined the daughter of the man you murdered would end up sitting in that command center when it happened. Whitfield's face had gone white. That's a serious accusation, he said, voice tight. It's not an accusation. Claire's voice stayed perfectly level, even as everything underneath it burned white hot. It's evidence. 5 years of it, already sitting in the hands of people you can't buy and can't threaten. This is over, General. For a moment, Whitfield said nothing at all. Then something shifted in his expression. The mask of outraged authority cracking away entirely, revealing underneath it something colder. Something that had been calculating, this entire time, exactly how far he was willing to go to keep his secret buried. You have no idea, he said quietly, what I'm willing to do to protect 30 years of work. He moved fast. Faster than Claire expected from a man his age, closing the distance between them with a speed that spoke of decades of training underneath the polished uniform and the practiced authority. His hand closed around her arm, hard enough to bruise, dragging her toward the small utility helicopter parked at the edge of the tarmac, his personal transport. Engines already spinning up from an earlier, unrelated order that suddenly made horrible sense. General, what are you? Claire twisted, trying to break free, but his grip held firm, panic and rage lending him a strength that surprised her. You're coming with me, Whitfield snarled. Consider it insurance. If that file reaches the wrong hands before I've had a chance to contain this, I need leverage. Claire's mind raced, adrenaline flooding through her exhausted body. Because this wasn't the calm, calculated Whitfield who'd stepped off that transport plane yesterday morning. This was a cornered man, desperate, dangerous in an entirely different way than careful corruption ever was. Let go of me, she said, low and hard. Get in the helicopter. No. Whitfield's grip tightened, dragging her another step closer to the spinning rotors, and for one terrifying moment, Claire genuinely believed he might actually force her aboard, might actually fly off this base, with her as a hostage against evidence already beyond his reach. Then a voice cut across the tarmac like a gunshot. Let her go. Derek Holt stood 20 feet away, still in his flight suit from an early morning briefing, his expression carved from something Claire had never seen on him before. Absolute, controlled fury. Beside him, Major Cole, and behind them both, Coleman, and 2 of the MPs who'd been part of Sanders's interrogation days earlier, all of them converging on the tarmac with a speed that suggested Grant had already alerted the entire base the moment Whitfield's true intentions became clear. Whitfield's eyes swept across the growing crowd, calculating, and Claire watched something in his face finally break, the last thread of control unraveling completely. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling to the tarmac, and sprinted for the helicopter instead. "He's running." Cole's voice, flat and urgent. "General's running for the chopper." Claire scrambled to her feet, adrenaline burning away every trace of the exhaustion that had weighed her down all night. Watched Whitfield haul himself into the pilot's seat of the small utility helicopter, because of course he could fly it himself. A man with 30 years in the service had more qualifications than anyone gave him credit for, and right now that qualification was the only thing standing between him and permanent disgrace. The rotors spun faster. The helicopter skids lifted a few inches off the tarmac. "He's not getting away with this," Claire said, already moving. Ashford, Grant's voice, calling after her, but she wasn't listening anymore, because there was exactly one aircraft on this entire base fast enough, and exactly one pilot skilled enough to stop a fleeing general before he vanished into hostile airspace and disappeared forever into whatever safe harbor 30 years of corruption had brought him. Claire sprinted for the same F-16 that had carried her into battle 4 days earlier, tail number 402, already fueled from routine morning checks. Sitting on the flight line, like it, had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Coleman," she shouted. "I need that jet hot now." Coleman didn't hesitate, didn't argue, just ran. The helicopter cleared the tarmac, banking hard toward the open desert beyond Ironhold's perimeter. Whitfield's silhouette, visible through the cockpit glass, hunched forward, desperate, flying toward a horizon that promised nothing but delay before the truth eventually caught up with him anyway. Claire scrambled up the ladder of 402, dropping into the seat with the same practice speed she'd found 4 days ago, hands moving across switches that felt less foreign now, more like an old language finally remembering how to speak itself. "Valkyrie, what's the plan?" Grant's voice crackled through her headset, tight with barely controlled alarm. "You can't shoot down a general's aircraft, Ashford. Whatever he's done, I'm not shooting him down." Claire's voice stayed perfectly level, even as her hands flew across the startup sequence, engine screaming awake beneath her. "I'm bringing him back." "How?" "The way I bring anyone back," Claire said, "by making sure he doesn't have anywhere else to go." The canopy sealed shut. The engine roared into full readiness. And for the second time in 4 days, Claire Ashford pushed a fighter jet, screaming down the runway and into a sky that had already tried once to take everything from her. This time she wasn't chasing rescue. She was chasing justice. The F-16 caught up to the helicopter in under 3 minutes, closing the gap with a speed that must have looked, from Whitfield's cockpit, like something out of a nightmare he had no way of outrunning. Claire brought her jet alongside the smaller aircraft, matching its speed, close enough that she could see Whitfield's face through the glass pale, sweating, eyes wide with a fear that finally matched the terror he'd inflicted on so many others over 5 long years. "General Whitfield." Claire's voice transmitted directly to the helicopter's frequency, calm and absolute. "This is Valkyrie. You are ordered to return to Ironhold immediately." Silence answered her. The helicopter banked sharply, attempting to cut away, and Claire matched the movement effortlessly, her jet shadowing his every maneuver with an ease that must have felt, to a man running out of options, like being hunted by something that had already decided the outcome. "You have nowhere to go, General." Claire's voice hardened. "Every base within 1,000 miles has already received that file. Every ally you thought you had is already reading about 5 years of stolen American lives. Running doesn't save you. It only proves what everyone's about to already know." The helicopter wobbled, slowed. "Turn around," Claire said. "Land this aircraft, face what you've done." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The helicopter hung suspended in the pale morning sky, Whitfield's hands visibly shaking on the controls, caught between decades of arrogance and the sudden, crushing weight of consequence finally catching up to him. Then, slowly, the helicopter began to turn. Back toward Ironhold. Back toward everything he'd spent 30 years trying to outrun. The landing was rough. Whitfield's hands weren't steady enough for grace. The helicopter's skids striking the tarmac harder than necessary, bouncing once before settling. MPs surrounded the aircraft before the rotors had even fully stopped spinning, weapons raised, voices sharp with commands. Whitfield had no choice but to obey. Claire brought her own jet down. Moments later, taxiing to a stop at the edge of the flight line. Hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go except through her fingers and into the quiet aftermath of everything that had just happened. She climbed down slowly, watched from a distance as two MPs pulled General Marcus Whitfield out of the helicopter, stripped him of the sidearm he'd forgotten he was wearing, cuffed his hands behind his back with the mechanical efficiency that stripped away, in a matter of seconds, 30 years of rank and authority and carefully cultivated fear. He looked smaller now, much smaller than the man who'd stepped off that transport plane yesterday morning. Like he owned the very ground he walked on. Whitfield's eyes found Claire across the tarmac, and for just a moment, something passed between them that felt almost like acknowledgement, not remorse. Men like him rarely felt remorse, but recognition maybe. The understanding that he'd finally been outmaneuvered by exactly the kind of person he'd spent 30 years learning to overlook. "You should have stayed invisible," he said, voice carrying just far enough for her to hear it. "It would have been easier for both of us." Claire walked toward him, stopped close enough that he had to look directly into her eyes, close enough that there was nowhere left for him to hide. "My father taught me something before you took him from me," she said quietly. "He said the people who get underestimated are usually the ones paying the closest attention." She held his gaze a moment longer. "You should have remembered that the investigation that followed moved faster than anyone at Ironhold expected. The Inspector General's office, once they'd verified the file Claire had transmitted, moved with an urgency that suggested they understood exactly how much damage a 5-year corruption network could do if it remained buried even one day longer. Investigators arrived within 72 hours. Forensic accountants, legal counsel, a quiet, methodical unraveling of everything Whitfield had spent decades building. Sanders cooperated fully, his earlier confession forming the backbone of a case that grew stronger with every additional piece of evidence Claire and Coleman had assembled. His own culpability wasn't erased. He'd still passed classified intelligence that had endangered American lives, but his cooperation and the desperate circumstances that had drawn him into Whitfield's orbit in the first place would be weighed by people with far more authority than Claire to decide what justice actually looked like for a scared young man who'd finally chosen, in the end, to do the right thing. Whitfield faced considerably less mercy. The financial trail Claire had uncovered connected him not just to her father's death, but to at least 4 other incidents across multiple bases. Over 5 years, American pilots lost, patrol routes compromised, lives sold for profit to whoever paid the highest price for advance warning of American movements. The scope of it, once fully documented, shocked even investigators who had seen plenty of ugliness in 30-year careers of their own. He would face court-martial, formal charges eventually including conspiracy, espionage, and multiple counts connected directly to the deaths his corruption had caused. But none of that happened quickly. None of that happened in a way that gave Claire the clean, satisfying resolution television dramas promised. Justice, real justice, moved slow and complicated and imperfect. What Claire got instead, in the days that followed, was something quieter, something that mattered more. 3 weeks later, Ironhold held a formal ceremony on the same flight line, where Whitfield's helicopter had once lifted a few desperate inches off the tarmac before Claire brought it back down to earth. The whole squadron stood in formation. Grant at the front, Holt and Cole beside him, Coleman just behind, Briggs rookie, still favoring his healing ankle slightly standing tall, despite the crutch he'd finally been cleared to abandon that very morning. Claire stood at attention as Colonel Grant read the citation aloud. Words about extraordinary heroism, about a communications technician who had, without hesitation, risked her own life to save an entire squadron from an ambush that should have killed them all. Words about integrity, about pursuing truth, even when that truth threatened to unravel everything she thought she understood about her own life. But the ceremony wasn't really about the medal. Everyone standing on that tarmac understood that. It was about something Grant said next, his voice carrying across the assembled formation with a weight that made even the desert wind seem to pause and listen. 5 years ago, Grant said, this Air Force lost a legendary pilot to a lie. Colonel Robert Ashford, call sign Reaper, was one of the finest aviators this service has ever produced. His death was ruled pilot error. That ruling was false, manufactured by a man who has since been held accountable for that lie, and for the American lives it cost across 5 long years. He paused, looked directly at Claire. Today, this Air Force formally clears Colonel Ashford's record. His death is now recognized for exactly what it was, a deliberate act of sabotage, committed against a pilot who discovered corruption and refused to stay silent about it. He died doing exactly what this uniform asks of all of us, standing for the truth even when the truth was dangerous. Claire's eyes burned. She didn't let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of the whole squadron. But something inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight for 3 long years, finally released. After the formation dismissed, after the handshakes and the quiet congratulations and the strange, overwhelming feeling of being seen fully, for the first time, by people who had once looked straight through her, Claire walked out to the edge of the flight line alone. Coleman found her there 20 minutes later, watching the sun sink low and orange over Talon Ridge, the same mountains that had nearly swallowed Tyler Briggs whole just weeks earlier. You did good, Ashford, he said, coming to stand beside her. We did good, Claire corrected. You're the one who found that file in the first place. You're the one who had the courage to act on it. Coleman shrugged. Some people would have burned that report the second they realized what it meant. Buried it, moved on, kept their head down and their invisibility intact. Claire almost smiled. I got very good at invisible over the years. Wasn't invisible, Coleman said. Just waiting for the right moment. There's a difference. She turned to look at him. You knew, from the beginning. You knew there was more to me than the coffee and the radios. 22 years fixing jets, Coleman said. You learn to spot things that don't quite fit the picture everyone else is looking at. You never fit that picture, Claire. Not for one single day. Later that evening, Claire found herself standing alone at the small memorial wall near the edge of the base, a modest structure, names etched carefully into dark stone, honoring every airman Ironhold had lost over the years. The base had stood in this unforgiving stretch of desert. Her father's name was there, had been there for 3 years, a single line among dozens of others, a quiet monument to a death everyone had believed was simple and tragic and nobody's fault. Except now, beneath his name, a small brass plaque had been added that afternoon. Simple, direct, killed in the line of duty, uncovering corruption that endangered American lives. His courage led directly to the exposure of a 5-year criminal conspiracy and the protection of countless service members who came after him. Claire pressed her palm flat against the cool stone, tracing the letters of his name with fingers that no longer trembled the way they used to. I did it, Dad, she whispered, voice barely audible over the evening wind sweeping across the flight line. Took me 3 years, but I finally figured out what really happened to you. She reached up, closed her hand around the dog tags, resting openly against her collar now, no longer hidden, no longer wrapped in black tape and silence. Nobody's ever going to underestimate you again, she said. And nobody's ever going to underestimate me either. Not anymore. Behind her, footsteps crunched softly against the gravel path leading up to the memorial. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Derek Holt stopped a respectful distance away, hands shoved into his pockets, uncharacteristically quiet. Didn't mean to interrupt, he said. You're not. Claire lowered her hand from the memorial wall, turning to face him. I was just finishing up. Holt studied her for a long moment, something in his expression she'd never once seen from him during 2 full years of careless jokes and casual cruelty. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. Not the kind I gave you on the tarmac that first day, when I was too shaken up to say it properly. You don't owe me anything, Holt. I do. His jaw tightened. I spent 2 years calling you radio girl, making jokes about whether you knew what an F-16 even was. And the entire time, you were carrying something I couldn't have imagined. Grief. Loss. A father's death buried under a lie that ate at you every single day, and you never once let any of us see the weight of it. Claire's throat tightened. It wasn't your job to see it. Maybe not. Holt shook his head slowly. But it should have been my job to look closer. Everybody's job, actually. We all walked past you for 2 years and never once wondered what kind of person builds walls that thick. Should have asked ourselves what she might be protecting herself from. He extended his hand. For what it's worth, he said, I'm proud to fly with you, Ashford. Whatever comes next. Claire looked at his hand for a long moment, then shook it, firm and steady. What does come next? She asked. For me, I mean. I don't exactly have my old cover story anymore. Holt's mouth quirked into something almost like a smile. Grant's already putting through your reinstatement paperwork, he said. Full flight status. Effective immediately, given everything you just proved out there over Widow's Pass and everywhere else these past few weeks. Claire's breath caught. Reinstated, she repeated, like the word might dissolve if she said it too carelessly. Ghost Squadron's getting its second Reaper, Holt said. Different call sign, obviously, but same bloodline, same fire. He studied her a moment longer. Word around the base is they're already talking about making it official. Valkyrie. Nobody's arguing that one. 2 months later, Claire Ashford stood on the same flight line, dressed not in a comms technician's uniform, but in a full flight suit, helmet tucked under one arm, dog tags resting proudly against her chest, where the whole world could see them now. Her right forearm still carried its scars, would carry them forever, thick and pale against her skin, a permanent reminder of fire and loss, and everything that had nearly ended her career before it ever properly began again. But scars, she'd learned, weren't always wounds waiting to reopen. Sometimes they were proof. Proof that you'd walked through the worst thing imaginable and come out the other side, still standing, still flying, still exactly who you'd always been, even when the whole world had spent years looking straight through you. Major Nathan Cole approached, clipboard in hand, mission briefing already underway for the morning's routine patrol. You ready, Valkyrie? He asked. Claire looked out across the tarmac, past the mountains that had nearly taken everything from her twice now, past the memorial wall, where her father's name stood cleared and honored, past every quiet humiliation and every hidden year of grief that had brought her to exactly this moment. She thought of her father, thought of the man who'd taught her to fly before she was old enough to legally drive a car, who'd whispered to her once, years ago, that the people who got underestimated were usually the ones paying the closest attention. She thought of every single day she'd spent believing that invisibility was a permanent condition rather than a temporary disguise. Claire slid her helmet on, snapped the chin strap into place with hands that no longer shook. Born ready, she said, and walked out toward the jet, into a sky that had once tried to take everything from her, and had instead somehow, against every possible odd, given her exactly who she was always meant to become. The desert kept secrets better than anywhere else on Earth, which was something Robert Ashford used to say, back when Claire was young enough to believe her father was invincible, back before call signs meant anything except a nickname stitched onto a flight suit, back when Reaper was just Dad, and flying was just the thing he did before he came home, smelling like jet fuel and sunburn, scooping her up onto his shoulders like she weighed nothing at all. This is a story about that. About him. About the 6-year-old girl who used to sit cross-legged on a hangar floor half a world away from Ironhold, watching her father run pre-flight checks with a seriousness that made her feel, even then, like she was witnessing something sacred. And it's about the woman that girl became. Because some things, once planted deep enough in a person, never really leave. They just wait. Quiet, patient, for the moment they're needed again. Claire was 6 the first time her father let her sit in the cockpit. Not flying, obviously, Grounded, engine off, canopy propped open to let the base heat roll through in slow waves. But she remembered the smell of it even now. 21 years later, that particular blend of metal and fuel, and something electric underneath it all, like the jet itself was holding its breath, waiting to wake up. This is the throttle, her father had said, guiding her small hand along the grip, careful, patient, the way he explained everything. You push it forward, the jet wants to fly. You understand? It wants to fly, Claire repeated. 6 years old, solemn as a church service. Everything wants to fly. Claire Bear. Robert Ashford's voice had carried that particular warmth he saved only for her, a softness the rest of the squadron never once got to hear. Some things just need somebody brave enough to let them. She hadn't understood it then. Understood it now with a clarity that sometimes stole the breath clean out of her chest. Because for 3 years, she'd been the thing sitting quiet on the ground. Grounded. Waiting. Convinced the sky didn't want her anymore. It had taken an ambush and a lie unraveling, and her father's own murder finally coming to light to remind her what he'd tried to teach her at 6 years old, in a cockpit that smelled like the rest of her life. Everything wants to fly. She just needed somebody brave enough to let her. The memories didn't stop there. Because grief, once it finally had permission to move instead of freeze, liked to unspool itself in pieces, out of order, arriving whenever it wanted, regardless of whether Claire had braced herself for it. She remembered her 12th birthday. Her father coming home 4 days late from a deployment he wasn't supposed to talk about, exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix, and still finding the energy to sit on the edge of her bed that night and ask her, seriously, like her answer actually mattered to him more than anything else in the world, what she wanted to be when she grew up. A pilot, she'd said. No hesitation, like you. Something had passed across her father's face then. Pride, yes, but underneath it something heavier, something that looked almost like fear. It's a hard life, Claire Bear, he'd said quietly. Harder than they show you in the recruiting posters. I don't care. I know you don't. He'd smoothed her hair back from her forehead the way he always did right before turning off the light. That's exactly why you'd be good at it. She hadn't understood the fear in his eyes back then, either. Understood it. Now. Because a father who loved flying more than almost anything on this earth had still, in that quiet moment, wanted to protect his daughter from exactly the thing he'd given his own life to. He'd been right to be afraid. He just hadn't known, not even close, how right. 14 months after General Whitfield's court-martial concluded a trial that made headlines, nobody at Ironhold had ever expected their quiet corner of the world to generate. Claire flew back to the small cemetery outside her hometown for the first time since burying her father. She hadn't been able to face it before. Not with a lie sitting on his headstone. Not with pilot error carved into granite like it was a fact instead of a fiction someone had built to protect themselves. She'd avoided that cemetery the way you avoid a wound that hasn't finished healing, circling wide around the pain, rather than walking straight through it. But things were different now. The Air Force had replaced the headstone 3 months earlier at Claire's request with language that finally told the truth. Colonel Robert Ashford, call sign, Reaper, beloved father, killed uncovering corruption that endangered American lives. His courage protected countless service members who came after him. Claire knelt in front of it now, the grass still damp from an early morning rain, sunlight breaking soft and gold through scattered clouds overhead. I brought somebody, she said quietly. Hope that's all right. Behind her, footsteps on wet grass. Derek Holt approached slowly, respectfully, stopping a few feet back to give her space, exactly the way he'd learned to do over the past year, without her ever having to ask. Because somewhere between the ambush and the court-martial and the long, complicated months of an Air Force, learning how to trust Claire Ashford again, something had shifted between the two of them. Slow, quiet. Nothing either of them had planned or particularly expected. It had started with coffee, of all things. Small, stupid irony that Claire still shook her head over sometimes. Holt showing up at her quarters some evenings with 2 cups instead of 1, sitting across from her without demanding anything, without performing the swagger that used to define every single interaction they'd ever had. just present, just steady. Until one evening, months into it, he'd reached across a small table in the mess hall and taken her scarred hand in his without hesitation, without flinching, like the burned tissue tracing up her forearm was simply one more part of her worth holding onto rather than something to look away from. "You don't have to be so careful with me," she'd told him that night. "I know," he'd said. "I want to be anyway." That had been enough. More than enough, actually, because Claire had spent 3 years building walls thick enough to survive an artillery strike, and Derek Holt hadn't tried to knock them down. He'd simply waited, patient, on the other side of them, until she'd decided slowly, on her own terms, in her own time to let him in. "Colonel Ashford," Holt said now, crouching beside her at the headstone, voice gentle in a way the old Derek Holt would never have managed. "Would have liked him, I think." "He would have terrified you," Claire said, a small smile tugging at her mouth despite everything. "First time you'd have met him, he'd have asked exactly what your intentions were, probably while cleaning a sidearm. Sounds like a man with good instincts." "He had the best instincts of anyone I ever knew." Claire's smile faded, something softer and sadder settling into its place. "Which is exactly why it never made sense to me, that someone with instincts like his could fly straight into a trap without ever seeing it coming. Because somebody made sure he couldn't see it," Holt said quietly. "That's not a failure of instinct, Claire. That's a betrayal built specifically to survive good instincts." Claire nodded slowly, reached out, traced her father's name carved fresh into the stone. "I used to think grief was something you got over," she said. "Like a fever. Something that burns hot for a while and then breaks, and you go back to normal. And now, I think it's more like flying." She looked up at him. "You don't get over it. You just learn how to carry the weight of it without it dragging you down. Learn how to keep climbing anyway." Holt was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that held more tenderness than she'd ever expected from the man who'd once called her radio girl and meant it as an insult. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think he'd be proud of you. Not just for catching Whitfield. For every single day after, too. The reinstatement. The Squadron. All of it." Claire's eyes burned, but she didn't look away from the headstone. "I hope so," she whispered. They stayed at the cemetery until the sun climbed high enough to burn the morning haze away entirely, sitting together in a silence that felt, for the first time in longer than Claire could remember, comfortable rather than heavy. Eventually, Holt cleared his throat, shifting slightly beside her, and Claire recognized immediately the particular awkwardness of a man, working up the nerve to say something he'd clearly been carrying for a while. "There's something I wanted to ask you," he said. "Actually been wanting to ask for a couple months now. Just didn't feel right doing it anywhere except here somehow." Claire's brow furrowed slightly. "Ask me what?" Holt reached into his jacket pocket, and for one wild, disorienting second, Claire's mind leapt somewhere she immediately told herself not to go, heart stuttering against her ribs before he pulled out not a ring, nothing so dramatic, not yet, not this soon, but a small velvet box holding something considerably simpler. A set of silver wings. Pilot's wings, worn slightly with age, clearly not new. "These were my grandfather's," Holt said. "Flew in Korea. Passed them down to my father, who never flew a day in his life, but kept them anyway, because some things you're supposed to hold on to even if they're not exactly yours to use." He turned the small box over in his hands. "I've been carrying them around for a while now, waiting for the right moment, the right person." Claire's breath caught. "Derek, I'm not asking you to marry me," he said quickly, a nervous laugh escaping him. "Wrong moment for that, probably. Wrong cemetery. Definitely." He managed a small crooked smile. "I just wanted you to have these. Because you spent 3 years being told you weren't good enough to fly. Weren't trusted enough. Weren't seen at all, really, by anyone who should have known better." He pressed the box gently into her hands. "I wanted you to have something that says the opposite," he said. "Something that says exactly what you are. What you've always been, even when nobody else was paying attention." Claire opened the box slowly, stared down at the small silver wings resting against faded velvet, a piece of another family's history now being offered. quietly and without expectation, into her own. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything." Holt's hand found hers, steady, warm, exactly the way it always was now. "Just fly, Claire. That's all I'm asking. Keep flying. Keep being exactly who you are." She pinned the wings to the inside of her flight jacket that same afternoon, tucked close against her heart, right beside the dog tags that no longer needed hiding, right beside 3 years of grief that had finally found somewhere honest to rest. The following week, back at Ironhold, Claire led her first solo patrol as a fully reinstated pilot of the 104th Fighter Squadron. Ghost flight, call sign Valkyrie, cutting a clean line through a pale morning sky that had once tried, twice now, to take absolutely everything from her. Coleman watched her go from the flight line, arms crossed, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his weathered face. Briggs stood beside him, ankle fully healed now, watching the jet climb with something like reverence in his young eyes. "Feels different," Briggs said quietly. "Watching her fly now, knowing everything we know." "Feels right," Coleman said. "That's the difference." Above them, Claire leveled her jet out against the horizon, sunlight catching the silver of her father's dog tags through the canopy glass, catching, too, the small hidden wings pinned close against her heart. She thought of a 6-year-old girl in a grounded cockpit, small hand guided along a throttle by a father who'd known, even then, exactly what his daughter was capable of becoming. Everything wants to fly. She pushed the throttle forward, felt the jet answer, eager, certain, exactly the way her father had promised it would all those years ago. Some things, once planted deep enough, never really left. They just waited, patient, for the moment they were finally fully needed again.